Welcome, little listeners, to tonight's bedtime story on our magical podcast, where dreams take flight and adventures are as big as your imagination. Have you ever had a toy that broke too soon? Perhaps a favourite teddy whose arm came loose, or a remote-controlled car that stopped working just days after you got it. Sometimes toys break because they're old or faulty, but sometimes they break because we haven't yet learned how to handle them with care. This is the story of Marco, a boy whose toys never seemed to last very long. His room was filled with broken wheels, loose stuffing, and crashed cars. But through a special discovery, Marco learns that the strongest hands aren't always the ones that grip the tightest. Sometimes, they're the ones that know when to be gentle. Join Marco on his journey from crash, bang, zoom to something quite magical as he discovers what it truly means to become a toy whisperer. "Happy birthday, sweetheart!" Mum beamed as Marco tore into the shiny blue wrapping paper. Inside was the remote-controlled helicopter he'd been dreaming about for months. "Brilliant! Can I fly it now? Please, please, please!" Marco bounced on his toes, the controller already clutched tightly in his hands. "Careful with that one, Marco," Dad cautioned. "It's quite delicate." But Marco was already racing to the garden, helicopter gripped firmly in his fist. His older sister Emma watched from the kitchen window, shaking her head. 3, 2, 1, lift off! Marco pressed all the buttons at once. The helicopter whirred violently, shot straight up, spun in circles and crashed into the garden fence. Bits of plastic scattered across the grass. "Ooh, Marco," Mum sighed, stepping into the garden. "That's the third toy this week." Marco's lower lip trembled. "It was faulty," he mumbled, kicking at the broken pieces. Later that evening, Marco sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by his toy casualties. His dinosaur was missing an arm, 3 trucks had no wheels, and his favourite teddy, Woolsey, had stuffing poking out from several spots. "Why do they make toys so breakable?" he grumbled, adding the helicopter parts to his growing collection of broken things. "Marco, time for dinner," Mum called from downstairs. As he stood up, Marco caught his reflection in the bedroom window. Behind him, he could see Emma's room across the hall, where her toys sat neatly on their shelves, looking just as perfect as the day she got them. "It's not fair," he muttered, shutting his door with a bang that made another toy fall from his shelf. "Why do her toys last forever and mine keep breaking?" He trudged downstairs, leaving behind a room that looked more like a toy hospital than a place for play. The next morning, Marco woke up early. As he reached for his new action figure, the one he'd gotten from Aunt Jenny just yesterday, he heard voices from Emma's room. "There you go, Sophie," Emma was saying softly to her favourite doll. "Let's brush your hair nice and slowly so it doesn't tangle." Marco paused in his doorway, watching. Emma's movements were different from his. Where he would have yanked the brush through, she drew it gently through the doll's hair. When she changed the doll's clothes, her fingers moved carefully, not pulling or tugging. "That's boring," Marco whispered to himself, but something made him keep watching. Later at school, during playtime, Marco noticed his best friend Oliver with the same car he'd had since Christmas. "How come your car still looks new?" Marco blurted out. Oliver shrugged, pushing it slowly around their makeshift track. "Dunno, I just play with it normal, I suppose." Marco looked down at his own car. The one he'd brought today had a cracked windscreen from when he'd made it do a super mega jump off his bed this morning. During lunch, he sat quietly, watching everyone with their toys. Lucy's skipping rope hadn't frayed like his had. Tommy's action figure still had all its parts, unlike Marco's collection of one-armed superheroes. Back home that afternoon, Marco stood in the middle of his room, really looking at his toys for the first time. He picked up Woolsey, his worn teddy bear. "Sorry about your arm," he whispered, touching the loose stitches where he'd pulled too hard during a game of tug-of-war with the dog. He sat on his bed, Woolsey in his lap, thinking hard. The room was unusually quiet, no crashing sounds, no banging, no toys flying through the air. "Marco," Mum called up the stairs. "Everything all right? You're very quiet up there." And "I'm fine," he called back. But was he? For the first time, he felt a funny feeling in his stomach as he looked at all his broken toys. He looked down at his hands. They didn't look particularly strong, just regular 7-year-old hands. But maybe, just maybe, he'd been using them wrong all this time. The sound of Emma's gentle humming drifted across the hall as she played with her toys. Marco walked to his window and saw Oliver in his garden next door, carefully washing his bike. "It's not the toys," he finally said out loud. "It's me." The next morning at breakfast, Marco barely touched his cereal. Instead, he watched as Dad fixed the broken handle of Mum's favourite teacup. "How do you do that?" Marco asked, noticing how Dad's big hands moved so carefully with the tiny pieces. "Do what, Marco?" "Fix things without breaking them more. Your hands are much bigger than mine." Dad smiled, holding up the now fixed cup. "It's not about size, son, it's about control, like when you're painting. You don't splash the paint everywhere, do you?" Marco thought about his art lesson yesterday, how he'd carefully kept his watercolours inside the lines. I suppose not. At school that day, Marco became a toy detective. During playtime, he sat on the bench instead of rushing to the playground. "Aren't you going to play, Marco?" his teacher, Miss Bennett, asked. I'm watching," he replied, eyes fixed on a group of girls playing with a delicate bubble wand. He noticed how little Tina held the wand lightly, dipping it slowly into the solution. When he'd tried bubbles last week, he'd snapped 3 wands in one afternoon. During lunch, he spotted his friend Jamal with a robot toy similar to his broken one at home. "Can I see how you make it walk?" Marco asked. Jamal demonstrated, moving the legs carefully. "If you force them, they break," he explained. "My big sister taught me that." After school, Marco lingered in Emma's doorway. She was arranging her stuffed animals for a tea party. "Why are you being weird?" Emma asked, catching him watching. Marco shuffled his feet. "How do you pick things up without breaking them?" Emma looked surprised. "Come here," she said, patting the carpet beside her. "Hold Mr. Whiskers." She handed him a small cat plushie. Marco grabbed it quickly. No, Emma shook her head. "Like this." She demonstrated with another toy, cradling it gently. "Pretend you're holding a baby bird." Marco tried again, this time more carefully. "Better," Emma nodded. "Now, want to join our tea party?" Marco nearly said no, tea parties were for girls, but he was curious. For the next hour, he watched Emma set up tiny cups, arrange biscuits, and move her toys with a gentle touch he'd never managed. That evening, Dad found Marco in the garden, practicing picking up leaves without tearing them. "Everything all right, son?" Marco looked up, his face serious. "I think I've been playing wrong, Dad, all this time. That's why everything breaks." Dad sat down on the grass beside him. "You know, when I was your age, I broke things too. Want to know what helped me?" Marco nodded eagerly. "Pretending everything was made of soap bubbles. If I move too fast or grab too hard, pop! No more bubble." "But what about when you want to play exciting games?" Marco asked. thinking of his favourite crash bang zoom playtime. Dad picked up a leaf, balancing it on his palm. "Watch this." He blew gently, making the leaf dance and swirl in the air. Sometimes the most exciting things need the lightest touch. Marco tried it himself, surprised at how much fun it was to make the leaf dance without destroying it. As the sun set, he looked at his hands again. They didn't feel different, but somehow they felt ready to try something new. On Saturday morning, Marco stood before his mountain of broken toys, hands on his hips. "Right then," he whispered to himself. "Let's try this properly." He picked up his newest car, the red one with only one wheel missing. Remembering Emma's advice about the baby bird, he held it gently. "Too loose," he gasped as it slipped from his fingers, bouncing off his toe. He tried again, this time gripping it tightly. "Too hard." The remaining wheels creaked in protest. "Everything all right up there?" Mum called after hearing the third crash in 5 minutes. "Just practicing," Marco called back, his face scrunched in concentration. By lunchtime, Marco had managed to play with his car for a whole hour without breaking anything else. His hands felt tired from concentrating so hard, but he felt proud. "You haven't asked for any plasters today," Mum remarked at lunch, usually accustomed to patching up Marco's fingers after his rough play sessions. "I'm being careful," he said, then promptly dropped his sandwich on the floor, trying to pick it up too gently. Emma giggled. "You look like you're trying to pick up soap bubbles." "That's the idea," Marco mumbled, remembering Dad's advice. That afternoon, Oliver came over to play. Marco watched nervously as his friend approached his toy box. "Want to play Space Crash?" Oliver suggested their favourite game of launching rockets across the room. "Actually," Marco hesitated, "could we build a space station instead?" Oliver looked surprised but nodded. Together, they carefully constructed a tower using blocks and boxes. "This is different," Oliver said after a while, "but kind of fun. It's like being real engineers." Just then, Marco's elbow knocked against their creation. He quickly steadied it with a gentle hand, something he'd never managed before. "Nice save," Oliver grinned. At bedtime, Marco's room looked different. Not perfect, there were still plenty of broken toys, but his new space station stood proudly in the corner, unbroken. "I noticed something today," Dad said, sitting on the edge of Marco's bed. "You didn't break a single thing." Marco beamed, then frowned. "But it's hard, Dad." "My hands keep wanting to grab and squeeze and throw." Dad nodded, understanding. "That's why we call it practice, son. Rome wasn't built in a day." "Do they build it carefully?" Marco asked sleepily. Dad chuckled. "Very carefully indeed, just like someone I know is learning to do." Sunday morning brought a surprise. When Marco came downstairs for breakfast, the dining table had been transformed into a repair workshop. Dad stood there wearing his old work apron, tools spread out neatly. "What's all this?" Marco asked, his toast forgotten. "Well," Dad smiled, "someone's been learning to be gentle. Thought it might be time to help fix some of the casualties." Marco's eyes lit up. "Really? Can we fix Woolsey's arm?" "And perhaps that helicopter," Mum added, bringing in a box of craft supplies. "Emma's offered to help too." Emma appeared carrying her sewing kit. "I'm the official teddy bear surgeon," she announced with a grin. For the next few hours the family worked together. By tea time they had quite a collection of fixed toys. The helicopter could hover steadily, Woolsey had all his stuffing back in, and 3 cars had their wheels firmly reattached. "Look what being gentle can do," Mum said, admiring their work. "But what if I break them again?" Marco worried, looking at his hands. "Then we'll fix them again," Dad assured him. "The important thing is, you're learning." 2 weeks later, Marco's room looked completely different. His once chaotic toy box had been transformed into organized sections. The wooden trains had their special place on the top shelf, sharing space with his newly repaired helicopter. Woolsey sat proudly in his shoebox bed, all his stuffing intact. And so, Marco's story teaches us something very special, that being gentle isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. His once broken toys now stand proud on their shelves, telling tales of a boy who learned to listen to them, care for them, and love them in just the right way. Remember, anyone can become a toy whisperer. All it takes is a little patience, a gentle touch, and the understanding that sometimes the biggest strength lies in the softest touch. The next time you play with your toys, think of Marco. Perhaps you too have a gentle superpower just waiting to be discovered. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to share the story with your friends and subscribe to our magical podcast. As the story ends and the children close their eyes, they enter a world where anything is possible, and then they dreamed.